Good afternoon. How are you? My name's Damo and I work for Wollondilly Shire Council, and welcome to the SustainaDilly online series of sustainable living workshops. We're here at the community garden. I don't know if you can see some of those beautiful snow peas just over there behind me, and there's a few butterflies and stuff flittering around. We've got a big sandpaper fig over my back over there, so it's really nice to be out here today. Now, this is the third in our series of workshops, and today we're going to look at no-dig gardening. We're also going to look at guild planting, which is companion planting on the next level. Now, I guess for me, I got into gardening about 25 years ago. I was a poor uni student living at home living in a house with a couple of other guys, and we didn't have much money, and we decided to start growing our own food. And we started making our own compost, and we started getting our own garden going. We actually used to go to the point we'd get our wheelie bins, and because we didn't have a car back in those days, and we'd wheel them 2 k's down the road to the local fruit and veggie shop, and they used to chuck out all their old fruit and veggie scraps into a big skip bin out the back, and we'd jump in there and load up our wheelie bins and then wheel them home so that we could get a nice big compost heap going to try and really juice up the soil. But today with no-dig gardening, it was, I guess, really made popular by Esther Dean back in 1977. She produced the book No-Dig Gardening, and that really was, she was quite at the forefront of her time then, but I'm sure no-dig gardening's been a method that's been used for generations before. But Esther Dean was an Australian lady who really sort of put it in the forefront of mainstream reality as a different way to garden. Now, why do you think we would do no-dig gardening? Well, there's a couple of key reasons there. And I think the main one is to try and reduce the amount of physical labour that we do into it. Now, traditionally, certainly on broad scale food production, it's all about churning the soil up and turning around with rotary hose and all that sort of stuff. Now, there's been a number of studies done that have found if you disturb the soil in that way, it really impacts upon the soil structure. It also impacts upon worms and all those little microbial and microorganisms that grow in that soil. So what we're trying to do is, I guess, support and enhance that and actually make it better as opposed to make it worse. Now, the other good thing about no-dig gardening is that you can build it anywhere. You can build it on a concrete slab. The area where we are today used to be an old car park. Well, it wasn't even a car park, it was just a gravel area. It's on top of an old landfill, so it wasn't really much good to anybody. So we decided to start doing some no-dig gardening. And what the whole principle about no-dig gardening is that you basically build up your layers on top of a flat surface, and then it doesn't matter what's underneath. And through that process, we're helping to build up the fertility of our area. Now, today, what we're going to do is I've got some straw bales here, and I've made them into a circle. And this is a way that we've created a raised bed. Now, you can see over the back here, we've got some corrugated iron raised beds as well. They can do okay. My only thing about using corrugated iron is in summer, that corrugated iron can get quite hot. And then you're getting evaporation and the roots are getting warm, and it can be a bit of an impact on the plants. So today I'm going to show you a method where we use straw bales. Yes, it's a little bit more short term. You'll probably get about 2 to 3 years out of your straw bales, but there's a range of different benefits of doing that. It's quick and easy. You know, you can pop down the local produce store. Just your standard garden straw bales are relatively cheap, and 6 bales will give you, a circle of about 2 meters. Now, the other benefit is that it's bringing organic matter. And particularly if you're building in an area like on an old gravel driveway or even building on concrete, you're going to add an organic layer as the border of your garden. But then the third main benefit is that when it rains, comes down, these straw bales end up becoming a sponge, and they're going to absorb that water. And then as the plants are growing, that moisture is going to go into your garden. It's sort of like a wicking bed, really. It's a natural wicking agent, and that is going to minimize the amount of watering that you need to do while your veggies are growing. Okay, so there's probably half a dozen key ingredients that we need for our no-dig garden bed. So number one, if you're going to do a straw bale bed, we've got our garden straw here. I've got some nice fresh cow manure. The stinkier, the better. And I do prefer cow manure, but look, if you've got good chicken manure or good horse manure from a nice clean sort of source, that goes great as well. So we've got plenty of that. We've got our loosened straw here. Now we're going to be loosened hay. We're going to be using loosened hay. Now lucerne is a nitrogen fixer, and when it grows, it actually gets nitrogen from the atmosphere and puts it down into the soil. Now, if we start putting that as layers inside our lasagna garden bed there, so where you normally have your lasagna shed in your lasagna, we're going to have loosened hay there. As that breaks down, that's going to release nitrogen into your garden. So we've got some good quality loosened hay here. Now, they do charge a premium for loosened hay, particularly because it's horse feed. Now, if you can get some loosened hay that's spent and not necessarily good for horse feed, you can get it a bit cheaper. So for your loosened hay, try to shop around a bit and try to get that second grade stuff. You don't need to get the primo that they use for horse feed. So we've got our loosened hay. So that's ingredient number 2, the main one. So we've got our cow poo, we've got lucerne. I've got some nice wheelbarrows of mushroom compost here. Now with the mushroom compost, again, sometimes that can be a bit rich because it has a lot of manure in there, but the source of mushroom compost that I'm using today has already actually been well composted. So any manure-based compost, it's quite rich to start with, but over time you can use that to grow your veggies straight out of if you've had a chance to compost that for at least 6 to 12 months. And then you know that manure-based compost is going to be fine to grow out of. So the mushroom compost that we have here today, we're going to be able to grow straight out of, but we'll talk more about compost and stuff later. And then I've got 2 other main ingredients. I've got dolomite, which is a type of lime. I'll just grab a scoop of that. Now we've got our dolomite lime there. Now the reason I like to use dolomite as opposed to just straight lime, calcium carbonate's in there, and that helps balance out acidity. So when we put manures in the garden and any sort of green material that breaks down, as it breaks down, it becomes more acidic. And if our garden is too acidic, then the plants will burn and they won't be able to grow properly. So whenever we put a layer of manure or a layer of mushroom compost in there, we're going to do a liberal sprinkling of dolomite. Now I mentioned it's got calcium carbonate. It's also got magnesium in there, and magnesium is number 4 on the plant food list. Got nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium. So I really like to get the dolomite in there as well. So we've got some dolomite. And then our last final ingredient is some blood and bone. So we're going to get that in there to bring phosphorus. That also has magnesium and sulfur and calcium in there as well. And blood and bone really helps when your plants are flowering and fruiting. So we're going to, again, each time we put a layer of manure, we're going to put a layer of blood and bone and dolomite in there as well. So they're our key ingredients. We've got our straw bales for the borders. We've got cow manure, we've got mushroom compost, we've got loosened hay, we've got dolomite, and we've got blood and bone. Our 6 core ingredients there. So I might give you a little look inside the garden bed and what we've set up here. So I'm just going to grab my camera here and switch it around. Now over in here, I'll just pull back a bit. You can see we've got our straw bales in a circle. Now our first layer that we've done in there is we've got a whole bunch of sticks and twigs in there as our bottom layer. Now if you are doing this on a grassy type area, particularly an area where you've got kikuyu grass, you may want to lay a cardboard in there first to stop those weeds coming up. But then what we've done here, the reason we've put the sticks and twigs in there is to try and get some drainage happening in there. Now that drainage, particularly if you're on a concrete surface or something like that, having those sticks and those twigs in there is just going to help that water drain away from the garden. Also, as that breaks down, that's going to be another layer that absorbs moisture and stuff in there as well. So we've got a whole bunch of wattle and other sticks and twigs and leaves. You can put even some of your old green weeds and any old food scraps and that sort of stuff in there as well. Because basically what we're looking at trying to do here is almost like produce a compost, but what we're going to do in the layers is then provide an avenue for the plants to grow from the top down. And then as the plants go down, say after 6 months, 12 months, they will then start tapping into the food that's down in those lower layers. So I'm just going to set you back on the stand over here. So have we got any questions so far? How you all going with that?
We've got a few hellos, Damo, from Wendy, Darnay and Stacey.
Oh, hi. Thanks for Wendy, Darnay and Stacey. Thanks for tuning in. How are your gardens going? It's a perfect time of year. We're supposed to be having a bit of rain during October, so it's absolutely perfect time. Now, you would have heard an extra voice over there. I've got my helper here, Ibrahim. We both work in the environment team. Come and say hi, mate. Ibs is going to be my muscles for the day. So the first thing we're going to start with is our cow manure. So we're going to start. I got a few bags here from the local, I went down to the Tamil Garden Centre. Now, if you are going to try and get your materials, it's really good to support local family-run businesses. That's, part of the ethos of working within the community. We think globally, but we act locally, and it's all about supporting local business. So we're going to start with our cow manure layer. All right, Ibs, you got your muscles there. So we're just going to layer this down in the bottom. Hopefully we've got enough to cover the whole bottom surface here. Now, ideally, I've bought this. Ideally, if you can pick some up straight from the farm, you're going to get nice, fresh patties. This has already been composted a little bit. All right, Ibs will get all these bags in. So we're covering up all the sticks, making sure there's no space left. Now, the good thing about these no-dig gardens is that with a couple of people, you can build them. Hopefully, we're going to build them in an hour. So it's nice and quick. Okay. So we've got our cow manure in there. Now, as I mentioned before, cow manure is really acidic. And as it breaks down, it's going to change the pH of our garden. And it's going to make it too acidic for the plants to grow. So now what we're going to do is put liberal amounts, when I say liberal, handfuls, sprinkling it across, of dolomite and blood and bone. And then we're going to water that in. Okay. Do you want to get onto the dolomite? Not a problem. I've got the blood and bone. So we're going to cover that. I'll give you a screen on that in a second. We're going to make sure we've got it evenly covered across the whole layer. This is like our bechamel sauce in the lasagna here. We've got a sauce of dolomite and blood and bone. Now the blood and bone, as I mentioned before, is really good for flowering and fruiting. So because we're doing this in layers, we're going to plant 2 or 3 layers up in our top layer here. As it starts to come down, and in a few months' time, when those plants start to flower, they're going to start hitting that layer of blood and bone, which is going to be perfect to give them that nutrition, so we get nice and healthy flowers and fruit. All right, so we've got all that. Okay, I'll give you a quick screen on that. We're trying to get really interactive here today. Okay, so we've got our blood and bone. Now, Ibs, can you please grab a watering can? Now, when we put in each layer, we like to water each layer in. So Ibs is going to water that in. Got to give it a nice liberal drink there. And we're just sort of dampening it down. And that's going to help. Literally, we're making a bit of a sauce here. That's going to help break that down. And it means that when our plants are growing, we're making sure that each layer is nice and damp. And ideally, when we plan out, we're not really going to have to water this garden too much. Okay, so we've got our dolomite, we've got our cow manure. Now over here, what I've been doing is we've got our lucerne hay. So what I've done here is I've, sorry, the iPad's turning around here. I filled this wheelbarrow full of water, and then I've broken the lucerne hay up into biscuits, and I'm soaking that. So now that our lucerne hay is also going to be nice and saturated, and this is our lasagna sheet that we're going to put in there. So Ibs is onto that. layering that. Now, as I mentioned, now make sure it's nice and thick, Ibs, because that's really providing a spongy layer, an absorption layer in the center that's going to help ensure that our garden's got water ongoing. And by watering in each layer, we really are going to we're going to be able to minimize the amount of watering that we do on this garden bed. Yeah, that's great. Now I'm actually going to get in there and do a bit of a stomp. Now all this stuff will break down. So your garden bed's going to drop over time. So we're giving that a bit of a stomp down just to make sure it's all layered in there. Okay, I'm going to put you back on the stand over here. Now, our next layer is going to be mushroom compost. So we're going to pull out a straw bale here. Do you want to pull out that straw bale over there, Ibs? Thank you. Now we're going to lay down our mushroom compost. So again, I've got Ibs here. We've got this great mushroom compost from Picton Sand and Soil. Now I found that the stuff they do there is quite well composted. Now again, we're going to spread that out. I'll get a second wheelbarrow there, please. We're spreading that all out. Sort of hard to spread. We're just going to, so we make sure all our lucerne is nice and well covered. That's great. So we've put 2 wheelbarrow loads there. I'll spread that out. You see, I was just spreading with my feet here. Normally, if I'd be home, I'm actually a barefoot gardener. I really like getting in amongst the compost with my bare feet. Okay, now we're going to add another layer of dolomite and blood and bone. Okay, so it's the same sort of principle that we had. I don't know if anybody tuned into the composting workshop the other week, but in composting you use a similar principle. So it's about getting your layers, and it's about getting that combination between brown and green, between your carbon and your nitrogen. And what we're basically trying to do is create a garden bed that is full of nutrition. Now, this particular garden bed and this design with the straw bales, you'll get 2 years worth of growth. So I'm talking summer, winter, summer, winter, before you really need to look at trying to top it up. Now, when we get these layers up, oh yeah, and if you could water that layer in. Have we got the dolomite in there as well?
Yep.
Cool. So we've got another layer of dolomite and blood and bone.
And blood and bone.
Blood and bone, that's great. Again, we're giving it a nice, good drink. Watering that in. And this is ensuring that over the next few months, coming into summer, we've got plenty of moisture inside our garden bed there. That's great. And now we're going to do another layer of loosened biscuits. So in a garden bed this tall, so we're probably talking at about maybe 40, 50 centimetres, maybe a little bit higher. We're going to have 3 layers. So we've got our manure, we've got our blood and bone dolomite, we've got our lucerne, mushroom compost, blood and bone and dolomite, lucerne, and then our growing medium on top. Now that growing medium on top could be your compost, if you've got a nice compost going at home. As I mentioned before, the mushroom compost that we've scored here today is well composted, and I can actually grow straight out of it. You do have to be careful. Some mushroom compost is quite acidic, and I've had that experience before where I've planted into it and all my plants have ended up going yellow and brown and sort of burning on the tips. So you want to make sure, it doesn't matter about these bottom layers, that's okay, because the roots aren't going to be growing into there yet. And by the time the roots start getting down through those layers would have started to balance out because we've got our dolomite in there. So we're going to have a balanced pH going down the bottom there. So we're nearly finished our bed. We're 20 minutes in, we've nearly finished our whole garden bed here. We're just going to put these last couple of layers on. Got a bit more here. Now again, we want to make sure that our mushroom compost layer is well covered. All we want to see is green on our top layer here. All the lucerne is nice and damp, which is great. You can see the water dripping off it. It's absolutely perfect. we got any questions? No, cool. How are you going along there? Could you just maybe share a like or something on the page to let us know if you've done any no-dig gardening before? Feel free to share any of your tips with us as well. Now, this is a method that I'd sort of learned about for quite a number of years, but I didn't really get a chance to implement. And I mentioned before that, you know, I started gardening probably 25 years ago, but over the years, my time with gardening has really changed and ebbed and flowed. And often when I've been working full time, I often commute to work. When I was doing that full time, I found my gardening really went by the wayside. And I guess the good thing for me over the last 6 months, particularly since the whole COVID thing kicked in, and I'm finding I'm starting to find a bit more work-life balance. And so it's been really nice over the last few months to be able to really get out in the yard and start growing food again. I mean, it's so nice to be able to just pop out the backyard and grab some fresh greens, get some fresh herbs, and be able to just cook up a nice feed, you know, and there's nothing better about it. It's healthy for you. You're out there being active, you're in the fresh air, you're in the sun, and seriously, to be able to just, you know, put a whole bunch of fresh food, and it's got to the point now, I'm 4 months down the track of reactivating my gardening. Every meal has got fresh produce coming into it, and as we come into spring and summer, we're really going to diversify that. So we need our mushroom compost there, Ribs. So we're going to do one more layer of mushroom compost, and then we're going to look at guild planting, which is companion planting on the next level. So we'll get our last layer in. Good stuff. Spread that around. Oh, nice and warm and nice and smelly. Vicky was saying before, now this is a partnership, this project. We're from the environment team, and we've been partnering with Vicky from Community Projects, and she was saying before she grew up on a farm, and so walking past that fresh smell of manure reminded her of home. And for me, that's what it's about too. Now, we've also partnered with Wollondilly Library, and Fiona from there, she's up here today hanging out with us. So we've been really looking at how we can work together within council to help share some of this knowledge with you folks out there as well. All right. So I'm going to switch this camera around, and we're going to start a look at the plants. So I mentioned about guild planting. Now, does everyone know about companion planting? We've got a few likes and a few people saying yeah. Now, companion planting is all about growing plants that grow well together. Now, if you look in a natural ecosystem, in a bush, in a rainforest, in a scrubland, you'll find that particular plants grow together. And that's what it's like in a veggie garden. You've got particular plants that are mutually beneficial, that will help each other grow, but then sometimes you can get plants together and they actually stop each other from growing, and they retard each other's growth. So we've got our companion plants, and say you might plant a tomato and you might do a bit of basil and maybe some celery or something like that. You might do 2 or 3 companion plants. The whole idea behind guild planting is that we're going to plant out a mini community within our garden, a little ecosystem, if you like. We're going to think about layering with our plants. So we're going to have ground covers, we're going to have mid-story and overstory. And what that means with guild planting is that we can actually plan out a higher density of plants and a higher diversity of plants. So in our little guild today, our garden bed is 2 meters across, and we're going to put over 14 different species in that little area so that you can see how densely we can grow our garden beds. And today we're going to look at a guild. Everyone loves their tomatoes. It's tomato season. So we're going to look at a tomato guild. So I'll just switch this around and take you over to our plants over here. All right.
One quick question, Dave.
Oh, yes.
Ash was asking if the layering method would be okay for the average garden bed.
Yeah, definitely. I've been at my house, I've got existing garden beds that were traditionally used for camellias or azaleas, all that sort of stuff, more cottage garden stuff. I've been converting those into food growing. And what I've been doing is actually just doing a scaled down version of this into any existing garden bed. So if you've got an existing garden bed with a rockery boundary, or maybe you've got some old raised beds, or maybe if you found a little sun pocket around the side of your house where there's just a bit of grass, you can easily do this no dig method anywhere you like. And it doesn't have to be as deep as what we've done here. This is more if you're having an isolated bed, but I've done it where I've only got, a few rocks that are, maybe 10, 15, 20 centimetres high. And so you can easily use this method anywhere. For me, what I've done is gradually over the last 4 months is just starting making little garden beds around the yard. I don't have a particular area where I grow my food. I've worked with the existing garden beds that are there, and I've tried to find where those little sun pockets are. And that sun pocket might only be 1 metre by 2 metres. I can still grow food in that area. There might be a little pocket near the fence where I can get a trellis and start growing my snow peas or my beans and that sort of stuff. So what I've been doing is just creating those little pockets around my backyard, trying to find out where there's a nice bit of sun. Great. Okay, well, I'm going to switch you around here and we're going to have a look at our plants here. Now, as I mentioned before, it's good to try and support local family-run businesses. So we're going to make a guild around our little tomato friend here. Now, this is a Roma tomato. I like Romas because they generally tend to be resistant to fruit fly, not so susceptible as some of the bigger sort of plants out there. I also do like to grow cherry tomatoes, all sorts of different forms, and they're great because they can end up sort of re-sprouting in the garden naturally. Now, down here, I always like to get my herbs in. So I've got some oregano. What herbs have we got here? Over here, I've got some sage. I've got some basil, and everyone knows that basil and tomatoes grow really well together. I've got some coriander in there. I've got another Roma tomato. Now, a couple of other things I'm going to grow in. Now, some plants will grow with all sorts of things. They're really cool cats that'll just, they don't hold back anyone's growth. They grow really well. So I've got some mixed lettuce here. I've got some silver beet. Every garden should have flowers, and marigolds are great. French marigolds in particular. They're really good for the soil. They're great for attracting pollinators. So I always try to get a few flowers in my garden bed as well. I've got some thyme down here. And then I've just got two more. I've got our parsley. Parsleys are great. You can plant parsley anywhere. And it's really good to just chuck that in with salads and on a sandwich and all that sort of stuff. I've got a couple of capsicums here. And then I've got some beetroot. So we've got our layers in there that we're going to use. So all up, like I said, I've got 14 different species. If I can just get you to put that bale back in there, that'd be awesome.
We've just got a few questions and comments. So
yeah.
Stacey has said that she hasn't heard of guild planting before, and it's really cool info, which is really nice.
Yeah.
And we've also got a question about how much sun you need to be able to have grow produce or have a garden like this.
Yeah, definitely. Great. Look, I mean, it depends on what you're growing. And I don't know if you've ever experienced that thing where you plant out your lettuce, you plant out your coriander, maybe your dill, and it starts growing, then suddenly it just bolts and gets really tall quite quickly, and it goes straight to seed, and you're like, oh, I didn't even get to harvest anything off it. And the whole point about our structure here with our garden is that we're going to have a tomatoes, there's our overstory, then we're going to have silver beet and basil. I've got some kale here too. I've got a couple of different types of kale. So that's going to be part of our mid-story. But then our understory is going to be coriander and some of those other herbs that tend to bolt. And they will quite happily grow in the shade. Now, you can grow this in full sun, but you can grow it ideally if you have a choice. You want a garden that's going to get afternoon sun or morning sun. I mean, generally, I tend to find in my garden, the gardens that only get morning sun don't tend to grow as well as the gardens that get afternoon sun. So, if you do have an area where that's partly shaded, focus on those leafy greens, things like silver beet with the big leaves, kale, things like coriander and lettuce. They don't mind growing in that dappled sun. Tomatoes, they really need full sun ideally to get a nice good crop. Otherwise, they're just going to mainly produce leaf and you're not going to get too much fruit out of it.
Did you need me to do any more?
Yeah, if you could just maybe just smooth that out a bit there.
Did
That's...
Any dolomite or blood and bone?
Oh, yes, another layer of dolomite and blood and bone on top.
Yep, and a bit of water.
And some water, that'd be great. Now, so as I mentioned before, we're going to start with our tomatoes as our centerpiece for the garden. We've got 2 tomatoes that we're going to put in this bed that's 2 meters across, and they'll be our centerpiece. And then we're going to build our garden out from there. We'll probably start with our basil. We'll then maybe put a couple of, maybe 3 capsicums. Now, we will be posting up this guild and how many plants of each guild on our website, so you can stay tuned for that. I didn't quite get it up in time today, but we will have a list of the plants that we've included in our guild today, plus some other guilds. Because basically what I did when I originally used this method was I set up the first bed, and I actually had bananas and broccoli and that sort of stuff in there. But then what I did each month was then make another bed, and then I ended up making a big circular mandala of all these little circular beds, and each bed had its own guild. So you might have an onion guild, and then you might, have your broccoli guild. We've got our tomato guild here today. So Ibs is watering away.
Would you like any mulch on this one?
We might put the mulch on after we've planted. Generally, I like to mulch after we've planted so that we can then get in around the plants. Plus, we know what our planting layout is. All right, I'm going to sit everyone back on the stand over here. Let me just flick that around. Trying to get nice and interactive here. Just put you back on the stand. It's all grassroots video around here, folks. Here at the community garden. All right. So we've got our 2 tomatoes. Whoops, I just dropped my lettuce there. Now I'm going to plant those. Now I'm decided to put 2 tomatoes in this bed because we want to get cross-pollination. And hopefully then we're going to get a better fruit set. So Ibs, if you could plant that tomato on that side.
No worries.
Now we're going to plant these at least 1/2 metre out from the edge of the bed because these are going to get quite tall. So what we might do, so the northerly aspect is that way. So what we're going to do is, this is east-west. We're going to go east-west on this side of the bed. So that way what we can do is when we plant on this side, on the on the southern side, the shaded side, that's where we can plant our things like coriander and those things that bolt. So we want to make sure we give the pot a good squeeze. I do the old nanu, Mork from Mork, and Mr. Spock, he used to do this one too. We're going to get a hand on either side, and we're going to tip. Now, what I like to do, even though the roots on this are pretty light, the roots, I'm going to just quickly show you, the roots have grown to the shape of the pot there. So what we're actually going to do is just tease those roots lightly out. Because if they keep growing, they'll keep growing in the shape of that pot. And it's not so much of an issue for tomato, but they're just going to get a bit of a chance if you just lightly tease and ease those roots out. So I'm going to plant that in.
How deep should we go, Damo, before we do plant tomatoes?
Look, with our tomatoes, I don't know if you've ever noticed, but tomatoes will quite happily send roots out up the stems. So it doesn't matter if you bury a bit of the stem on the tomato. And sometimes as your tomatoes get older and taller, and if they're starting to get a bit starved for nutrients, they'll start sending those roots out. And you can actually come back later and start packing compost up around those stems, and then those roots will quite happily start growing out. You want to make sure your leaves are exposed. You don't want to bury the leaves, but you can actually pack it up around the base of the stem there as well. All right, so we've got our basil.
Yep.
Right. So I've got this jam-packed punnet full of basil here. Now, personally for me at home, I've just set up a little hothouse, and I like to actually pot these up into little pots and grow them on for a bit. And when you look at it, there's got to be at least 20 or 30 seedlings in there. So you end up with a forest of basil. But what we're going to do today is just break off, a couple of little chunks with maybe 3 or 4 basil. And we're going to plant them in a bit of a circle around our tomatoes, okay? All right.
So we just had a question from Bear. who's having a few tech issues, but this will be available to watch later on anyway.
Yeah.
But in terms of her tomatoes, her lower leaves are turning a bit yellow. Does she need to worry about that at all? And she's asking, is sun an issue?
Look, it could be a combination of things. Generally, it depends on what the yellowing is. If there's yellowing between the mid veins, then that generally tends to be a magnesium deficiency. It is probably some sort of nutrient deficiency if it's yellowing but there's no tip burn. If you get like brown, sort of crinkly, dried up tips to the leaves, that's probably acidity. But maybe I would try magnesium first. Now you can get just your magnesium bath salts. You can dissolve that in a watering can, maybe put it in a spray gun and actually spray that on the leaves. And the leaves will absorb that magnesium. You can even do that with your dolomite and they'll actually absorb that magnesium. So I'd probably try that first. It depends, yeah, again, what sort of medium are you growing them? Is it a compost that you're growing or is it just a standard garden soil that might be a bit low in nutrients? Generally, you'll find sun won't create yellowness. It's normally a nutrient sort of issue. And if it's not nutrients, then maybe it's acidity, which affects nutrients anyway. But I'd start with the magnesium. Even you can sprinkle the magnesium on the surface of your garden and just water it in so it gets absorbed by the roots for a more immediate effect. Like I say, make a spray and spray that on the leaves and that'll get absorbed through the leaves. All right, so we're going to break these off into little chunks. There we go, Gibbs.
Thank you. Would this type of medium and this method help avoid nutrient deficiencies for people?
Yeah, that's right. And that's really what this whole... That's why we've got all our different ingredients, 18 months to 2 years, depending on how heavily you area. We're going to have plenty of nutrients. Is like I say, a bit of magnesium. Look, ash from the fire, good as well. That's high in potassium, good. And you know, also got any wormweed or sea salt, which we'll look at a little bit later once we've planted out. But generally, this garden and this design is going to have enough nutrients there for the next 18 months at least. Full of
just around the tomatoes.
yeah. I might just do 3. I'll do 1 on either side. And like I said, I'd actually prefer to pot these up and then maybe scatter the basil around the yard. And that's what I do at home. And it's great. You'll buy a punnet for $4.30 and so you can crazy. All right. So now we've got our chickens. I'll probably in this garden. I'll do 3 capsicums because again it's high and probably about 30 centimetres wide, and we're going to space those away from our tomatoes. But what will happen is that our roamers are going to be our canopy. And
if people are buying veggie seedlings, do they need to increase their chances of success?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's always good to make sure you're trying to get your plants from a good source. And I have to admit, going down to Tamil Garden Centre today, they had a really good selection of plants. You want to make sure that the plants are nice and green. Again, when I bring these home, I tend to grow them on a bit. Each plant has got 2 sets of leaves. Unless you're out in the garden every day, like for me, I might get out there only once a week. I'd probably be inclined to maybe grow these on a little bit at home first before I planted them out. But you want to make sure they're nice and green. Ideally, if you can get from good seed stock, a lot of these plants that you tend to buy from nurseries aren't necessarily going to produce seeds, so you've got to keep buying plants every year. Ideally, if you can get some heritage heirloom seed and start doing your own propagation, and our previous workshop was on propagating native plants, but a similar principle for propagating veggie seeds. Some areas have got seed saver networks. If you can tap into that, where people have grown seeds in your local area for for a number of years, and what you tend to find is that plants will adapt to that local environment. So with each generation of seed that's produced, they're getting more resistant to the dry and the heat and the cold and all those sorts of things. So ideally, if you're a long-term gardener, you really want to try and get your own seed banks going. There's heaps of great open pollinated organic seed sellers out there online, like Eden Seeds and Diggers and all those. There's heaps of great places where you can get that sort of stuff. We did a quick run today because we're keen to sort of get some stuff in the ground. But the next phase for us, once our volunteers return to the nursery, is going to be about propagating those seedlings from nice heirloom open pollinated varieties that will produce seed in the future. All right, so we're probably just going to get 2 or 3 of these. Now again, we're very carefully tipping these out. Now, when we're breaking these off, try to sort of gently tease them out so we're not damaging the roots. That one, see, that's come off already. We've got 2 there. Here you go, Ibs.
Is there any place in particular that you'd like these guys planted?
So we're going to space these away from our tomatoes. Again, we want to try and space our capsicums at least 40 to 50 centimetres apart from our tomatoes and from each other, so they've got plenty of room to grow. So if you want to do one over there, I'll do one on the sunny side over here. Actually, I might just leave 2. It's nice to have symmetry sometimes in the garden. I mean, we're creating a garden that's not in rows, but we've got a tomato on each side and then we've got a capsicum on each side. We've got a nice bit of symmetry. We've got a number of other beds, as you can see over the back here. So now we're going to use these to plant those out in those other beds. So we've got our capsicums in. Now our next biggest plant, I guess I like to focus on the tall plants first. So now we're going to look at our kale, because kale can grow for multiple seasons. Kale is really good in iron. I'm a vegetarian, and so my leafy greens are essential for my iron intake. Now, I guess the main thing, if you're trying to focus on getting your iron from leafy greens, you also need to have vitamin C. So when you're cooking up, capsicums are really high in vitamin C. So when I'm cooking my leafy greens, my kale, my silver beet, bok choy, I always mix that in with capsicum so that I've got that vitamin C and iron uptake, which is ensuring I'm getting the most iron that I can out of my plants. So we've got our kale here. We've got 2 types. We've got the purple Tuscan, and we've got 3 types here. So we've got the frilly and the smooth leaf. Now, generally, I tend to find the frilly leafed one is less susceptible to being munched by grubs and that sort of thing. But ideally, again, about this guild planting, is that by planting out the smelly herbs, we're helping to reduce the impacts of bugs and critters. And by having a diverse species, we've got 14 different species going into this one little garden bed here. It's going to minimise the potential for grubs and bugs, the cabbage moth and that sort of stuff, to really get a hold in your garden. So we'll do one of each of these, I think. So here you go, Ibs.
Yep.
And again, we'll plant that in the centre there.
Yep. Do you want these little roots teased out as well?
Yeah, that'll be good. So again, see, these ones have been in here for a bit longer, and those roots are really chewed in around the base of the pot there. So I'm going to pinch those off altogether. Like that. It's a little bit harsh, but these plants are young. They can recover well. And then we're going to plant 3 of those. Again, because these get tall as well, they probably get as tall as the capsicum. We're going to space those out around our garden bed as well. Do you want to put one more of those? No worries. Over there, thank you. So we've got our kale. And kale's one of those friendly plants that it doesn't really, it's a cosmopolitan plant. It gets on with everybody, just like our silver beet. So, and that's what we'll go for next, I think. Well, so we're going to put a couple little silver beets in there. Oh, we've got our beetroot.
Oh, sorry, we've got the
silver beets just over there. So again, in a garden like this, I'm probably only going to do maybe 3 or 4 silver beet. They can get quite tall and the leaves are quite broad. If you could just maybe plant a few of those in.
No worries.
Now, I guess the main principle that I'll focus in on here is obviously we've got a lot of plants in a small area. And then within the next couple of months, they're going to really start growing in on each other. But the beauty of this garden bed is that because it's so dense, you're not really going to get weeds coming in because there's no space for them to grow. But ultimately, your gardening method becomes actually just harvesting food to give space for all the plants to grow. So that's the only garden maintenance you need to do in this type of a garden. It's really dense, and you're going to find yourself harvesting every day. And the technique is just about getting in there and just pulling a leaf off here and a leaf off there, and just trying to create a bit of space around each plant so they can all grow. You have to make sure you tie your tomatoes up so they're staying nice and upright and giving that canopy. You may even prune a few of your lower branches on your tomato to let those layers in between. And that's really all your garden maintenance becomes. We've already put our moisture layers in with each layer of that lasagna, and our garden's just going to crank. And the first time I ever made a mandala out here, actually at the nursery, was a good maybe 8 years ago now. We planted it around this time of year, and every week for 6 weeks, the garden was doubling in biomass. Now, it was a bit of a wetter summer that year, but out here in Picton, it gets quite hot. But because we'd done all those water layers in there, it was really starting to grow. So I'm going to try and dig up those photos, and we'll try and post those online as well, because it was quite amazing. I'd never seen anything like it, where every week the plants were doubling in biomass, and it was just growing more and more. And ideally, you'd be here doing this with us. So hopefully soon the nursery will be opening up, and then we can all get our hands dirty together. All right, so we've got our tomatoes, capsicum, basil, kale, silver beet. Now we're going to start getting our herbs in there. So, yes. So we've got our main herbs are oregano, sage. I love sage. Sage is really cool. I've been scoring some white sage lately, and I've got that growing in the garden. It's such a beautiful aroma. And I've got a few different types of sage now. So I'd love to get a bit of sage in the garden. It's beautiful aromas, beautiful flowers. So we've got parsley. I've gone for a flat leaf parsley here. Now, the parsley I grew last year, I went for the frilly one. It's now coming up as a weed. I reckon if you've got food coming up as a weed in your garden, then you can't be going too wrong. And ultimately, for a garden, that's what I sort of aim for. There's a little bit of management there, but I've got things like mustard lettuce, parsley, all now sprouting up and regenerating naturally in the garden. And that's the ideal type of food for us, isn't it? You don't even have to do any work. You just go out there and harvest. All right.
So, Damo, I know we can talk all day about this stuff.
I know.
We've got about 10 minutes to go.
Oh, we'll be here all day.
Yeah.
All right. Well, you've got the gist anyway. We're going to plan out. Here we go.
Cool. So I'll just put the herbs in.
Yeah.
Would you like to? Would you like anything in particular at the moment?
Yeah, the marigolds. So let's do a quick recap. We've got our beautiful French marigolds here. So our key ingredients, do you remember them? We started with our manure. We then did our dolomite, blood and bone. We then had our layer of our lasagna layer with the soaked lucerne hay. Lucerne puts nitrogen in the soil, really good, breaks down. It works as a sponge within the garden. We then did our mushroom compost, another layer of blood and bone, dolomite, lucerne, and then on top. And then we've got our guild planting here. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to put that guild planting up online, so stay tuned. We'll let you know what species are in there. Now, we had 14 different species in our garden today, and we'll let you know what numbers. But yeah, for me, I first implemented this about 5 years ago after 20 years of gardening, and I was amazed at how much food I was able to produce. My neighbours ended up sort of jumping the fence and starting to harvest food for themselves as well. So it's all about abundance. And if you can create enough for yourself, then you're winning. If you can create stuff for your neighbours, and maybe start trading food with anybody else in your community that may be growing gardens as well. Maybe there's some people that in isolation, some elderly people, maybe your grandparents or your parents, or maybe there's a neighbour that can't get out as much. Maybe have a yarn to them and see if they're doing any gardening, or if you're producing any food for yourself, maybe see if they could do with any extra produce as well, because this really is a community-based sort of thing. I think we need to get away from our corporate produced food and get back to my parents always grew food, and growing food in your own backyard is such a rewarding, healthy, replenishing thing to do. And if you can share that with your neighbours, share that with your family, then we can only be better people for that experience. So yes.
Sorry, Damo, in terms of finishing up as well, we'll get the rest of these planted, but then we just essentially water them in and give them a good mulch over the top?
Yeah, so we'll do another final layer of water, and then I'm going to get just garden straw. You don't want to do it too thick, because if you do a mulch layer that's too thick, when it does rain, it can actually stop the rain getting through to the water, to the soil. So we're just going to do a thin layer in amongst all the plants. It's going to be thin enough to just sort of help retain moisture and stop evaporation from the top of the garden mix, but it's also going to allow that rain to get through into the roots as well. And there we go. You can see it here now. We've planted out quite densely. We're nearly there. Ibs is just putting the last few plants in. We've got lettuce, we've got beetroot, and check in with us in a month or so. We'll share some photos of how the garden's going. If you've got any photos of your garden, please share them with us. We'd love to see how your garden grows. If you've got any tips or hints and stuff that you want to share with us, please share that as well. If you've got any questions, you think of something in the middle of the night. I think about gardening. I dream about gardening sometimes. I'll think of stuff in the middle of the night. Send us a message and we'll try to get back to you as soon as we can. So what do you think, Gibbs?
Yeah, it's looking pretty good.
It's looking pretty good.
Pretty good.
The plan is we'll be open to volunteers soon. We're just trying to get our COVID-safe management plan sorted out, but we're really looking forward to opening up to you folks to be able to come out to our garden and to get our native plants happening again. So that about wraps it up. Have we got any final questions?
We do. We had one from Stacey about her plants struggling in summer, dying over summer. So is there anything that they can do, maybe in terms of watering or keeping it water-wise?
Yeah. So, yeah, look, I mean, there's a couple of things you can do. Some plants don't like full sun, and I know I've had success at times, particularly things like coriander, where you can make little shade cloth tunnels, or maybe get a bit of bamboo and just make a little shade cloth to try and take the heat out. Water is everything. We had those pretty strict water controls last season, and it got to the point where you couldn't even use a hose to water your garden. We're not in water restrictions at the moment. If you are going to water, make sure you either do it early in the morning or late at night. You don't want to water in the heat of the day. Ideally, I like to do it the night before, because then it has all night to sort of soak in, and as the day grows, and that water's there for the plants. Think about maybe putting in an irrigation system. A little drip feed irrigation system with that brown pipe with little drip feeders. You can put that in under your soil bed. I also like to do a little overhead sprinkler, little twirly sprinkler head, because sometimes in the morning the plants like to have a drink through their leaves as well as through their roots. So I tend to do a hybrid system. So have a think about that. Generally in a garden like this, you can't overwater it, but that's the hardest thing during summer. Maybe get a timer and set that up to your tap. That way you don't have to think about it. And certainly when we're in level 2 water restrictions, you have to have a timer. You're not allowed to water without that. So think about installing a little irrigation system, maybe a little timer, and watering in the mornings or the evenings.
And all this organic matter will also help retain that moisture as well, Damien, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. So as you saw before, we watered in each layer. So all that loosened hay was all soaked in wheelbarrows full of water. So that's all got water in it. We watered in each layer of blood and bone and dolomite onto that manure and onto the compost. And also our trusty straw bales here, when it does rain, they're going to absorb all that moisture. And that moisture, that then comes like a sponge, and that moisture is going to wick into the garden, and so you're going to have a natural watering system going on within this garden bed. So again, that's another benefit of this no dig method. It's going to minimize the amount of watering that you need to do. All right, well, I think that's looking pretty good. We've done this in less than an hour. I wasn't sure whether we were going to be able to do it, but big thank you to Ibs helping me out here, man. Good work. He's a fellow plant grower. His whole yard has been converted into natives, and he's got asparagus coming up wildly everywhere. And so he's a bit of a gardener like me. We like to have a combination, and it's nice to get some native plants in your garden. They're going to attract pollinators, native bees into your garden. and that's a really good thing too. Now, a big thank you to Fiona and Vicky from the Wollondilly Library, Fiona from the library, and Vicky from Community Engagement Team for their support and helping us make this happen. Thank you for tuning in today to our No Dig Gardening workshop. I hope you've found it useful. Feel free to ask us any questions after the time. Our next workshop's in a fortnight, and that's going to be on water-wise gardening with native plants. That's going to be about creating a habitat garden and a bush tucker garden and all that great stuff as well. So thanks again. I think we all got on our questions, mate.
I think so. Thank you very much, everyone.
Awesome. Take care. Happy gardening, and please share your photos, share your tips. Let's build up a storyline. Share it with your friends, share it with your neighbours, share it with your family, because that's what growing food's all about. All right, take care. Thanks a lot. See ya.